Hi, I'm Tyler, and this is the Fox Valley Film Critics. In this special episode of the show, we're going to be talking about Jesus Christ Superstar. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the show, brought to you by Groupthink Productions and FVTV. Joining us once again is our favorite grad student, Meaghan. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. So you specifically asked to talk about this movie. Tell us why you wanted to talk about this specifically.
Well, this movie is something that's actually been really important to me and my family. My mom actually, when she was a kid, listened to the soundtrack, and then the film came out when she was a young teenager. And she ended up getting saved through Jesus Christ Superstar. Yeah, it's a really interesting story.
It's a very unconventional story.
It is. But I think for her, it just kind of struck her how there was this man who was willing to sacrifice everything for her salvation specifically. And somehow the soundtrack really spoke to her that way, and she decided to become a Christian, and she has been one ever since. And so, yeah, actually, this movie is kind of foundational to me.
I gained my patriotism through Hamilton. So.
Yeah, basically.
I'm being a little snide. I actually had not seen the movie until last week, but I can see why you definitely like this. This is on the upper end of musical adaptions I've seen, but that's not a high bar for movies, really. I mean, there's so many like the really huge pop musicals. They tend to get the Hollywood treatment, and it's Joel Schumacher's Phantom of the Opera or.
Not a lot of substance there, but this really packs in a lot and it's kind of beneath the surface. You have to dig a little deeper to figure out what's going on, but there's a lot going on here. But overall, what did you think of the movie for the first time watching it?
I had a similar reaction to this that I probably had when I watched Last Temptation of Christ for the first time, which was interesting because I just reviewed that a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And that was I had the same reaction. I think the reaction to this is probably very similar to that, where it's people immediately look at the thing and say, "Oh my gosh, there's Jesus in profile with naked people. This is totally wrong. I can't abide by this."
Yeah.
Because people were very sensitive today.
I'm
and
sure.
then
Yeah. I'm sure Temptation probably was even more controversial. But back in the 70s, I mean, when this came out and when they were touring for the musical and stuff, there was major controversy. They had crowds outside the theaters protesting. It was really interesting. So.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, just at a glance, there's kind of the movie is half like Broadway camp and the other half 70s counterculture.
Yep. But what's interesting, I think most people sort of think that the controversy was the way that they handled Jesus. I mean, he has like a girlfriend and all this stuff in there.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But I think that the real controversy, or the biggest one, was that they portrayed him as a man, and that directly contradicts the Trinity doctrine that's mainstream Christianity, and that was actually the biggest problem that people had with the movie, was that it did not portray Jesus as divine enough. But if you look at the movie, if you think about it, I mean, and my story about my mom, I mean, that was exactly what drew her into the story, and what, I guess she based her faith off of, was that, Jesus Christ was a living man. And, to see that perspective is really powerful. But that's exactly what it was protest against.
That's the same complaint people had against Temptation, is that people don't like the idea of seeing him through just the lens of a human being going through all that. They want to see him as something above that.
Yeah, and it's kind of strange because, the Bible says that Christ is tempted in all the ways that we are. So, I mean, to, again, see the story of a man like us is really powerful, and I think that's what Jesus Christ Superstar is going after. I mean, not to get too religious or anything like that, because the movie itself doesn't even, preach whether he was risen or not. I mean, that's kind of the whole question of it. But, again, to connect to the Christ story at a personal level, I think is what makes these films really powerful.
Yeah, I'm watching this. I definitely thought, who is this made for exactly? Because you see everyone dancing, and there's a huge multicultural band of people, and everyone's cast as a different race and different skin color, and the set design is littered with tanks and buses and assault rifles, and It's like, okay, there's Vietnam imagery in there, there's protest imagery in there, this is the most 70s thing ever. And I've seen a lot of 70s movies.
Yeah, so actually that's one of my favorite things, and we can kind of start there, is the way that they transcend time. So, I mean, you're simultaneously living, I guess, the past and Jesus' biblical time, but then you're also living the present moment too, and they just switch back and forth really easily, and I think it is supposed to comment on how we perceive Christianity nowadays, and like what it's grown into versus what it was when it started, and what has been lost in translation, and I think that's a huge question that the film asks.
I forget who wrote this. I know it was the same guy who did Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Yeah, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Mm-hmm.
Is he religious, or is this like a kind of an ironic look at it?
So I think it's like they're not super religious, but they're definitely working through their questions. I think that it's one of those middle of the road things. They're kind of
it's a Catholic guilt movie. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's really interesting. I mean, Jesus Christ Superstar, I think, was originally written in like the late 60s. So it was like they were pretty young when they were working on it. And then they did a test album in 69, and everyone kind of thought it was like a crazy idea that it was never going to work. And then they started touring, I think, a little bit in the early 70s, and it just got really popular. And then Jewison is the director of the film, and he came in and wanted to kind of do his own thing, but wanted to make it a film, and after that it just exploded, and it's been this thing. I mean, Ted Neely still tours as Jesus Christ, so
oh my.
Yeah.
That's a long tour. What would that be, 40 years? More than that.
Yep. That's pretty much all he does. He still looks like Jesus, actually, with the hair and everything. No.
Keep the hair, just keeps getting longer.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, you brought up the modern kind of symbolism and imagery in the movie, so we can kind of talk about that. The first scene you see is this like weird like bus coming in the desert, and then all the actors kind of come out and put on their costumes and like that, and they're kind of acting like just, I don't know, young adults, like kind of 70s hippies, just like doing whatever. And then as the overture progresses, they switch and they fully become their characters, and you have Jesus Christ putting on his robes and everything like that, and it's this interesting shift between actor and then biblical character, and like who are they really throughout the whole film. I think that's an interesting question. Also, Jesus Christ doesn't actually get back on the bus at the end, so that's again kind of emphasizing his death, and who exactly in our faith and in our religion, when we're thinking about Christianity, have we crucified? Is it just a man, an actor, or is it really this, deity? I mean, so it's really interesting how they kind of leave it all open to interpretation, but we can kind of go back to that at the end.
Have you ever heard the monologue from the beginning of Henry V?
Yes, I have, but I don't remember it.
It's essentially just to summarize it. It's William Shakespeare apologizing that they can't depict a massive battle scene, in his play, but in whenever they've adapted it, in basically every version, they keep the introduction as like the narrator introducing you, and then you basically go from the stage of the show into the story. So I kind of think of that transition of like the actors introducing it and then into the world of the show, which is interesting in the context of this, because it's in this version it would be these young 70s actors fitting into the role of these characters. So I guess that would add another layer to that, where it's people from this decade in time trying to live out these ideals has been a way they understand, I guess.
No, exactly. I think that's precisely what it's getting at. That's actually a really good parallel with Henry V. And you see like all their personalities kind of coming through. I mean, especially when you have like the villains that get off the bus and put their costumes on, and then you have to think, well, are they really villains? And how, and it kind of gives us more depth to the whole film again. And as you say, people of that time period are trying to live out these ideals, but then it parallels any time period, any audience watching the film, trying to live out the ideals in the story themselves too. So it's just a very personal sort of setting. So yeah, I think it's a powerful way to start the film. When I first saw it, I thought it was like super weird, because like this like 70s like hippie bus is coming in. My mom like desperately wanted to show me this film when I was old enough, and so I'm watching it and I just turned to her and I'm like, what is this? This is what it's ridiculous. But it works. It really works. So yeah. Were there any specific scenes you wanted to highlight? I mean, I have stuff on everything.
I don't know. I mean, it covers the broad range of the story, but every scene is done in a very strange way. I mean, what I'm assuming the Pontius Pilate character was the white man, the white fellow with the glasses and the open shirt, and I'm just like, there's some very strange versions of these characters being explored, but like that's. Where would you want to start specifically?
Well, yeah, we can go through like the characters and stuff like that. I don't know. Well, I guess I could talk about the actual historical setting a little bit because this.
I'm gonna pause right there. We need to take a cut to a quick break. Hello, welcome back. I'm sorry to rudely interrupt you there.
No problem. I could talk about the historical setting a little bit more because the film does actually draw on that more than I think people will pick up from just the biblical story. So basically it's set at Passover or about a week before Passover. At that time in Jerusalem, there are thousands upon thousands of people coming into the city, so the population swells immensely. It's really politically contentious because the Romans are a little worried about having all these people in their colony, basically, that are celebrating a holiday that basically highlights rebellion, right? Because the Jews leave Egypt and all of that. And so everyone's a little bit tense. Actually, Pontius Pilate, they think, didn't necessarily live in Jerusalem. They thought he lived a little bit north in Caesarea, or if I'm saying that right. And so he would come down to the city at that time during the Passover to kind of like be a Roman presence. And so that pissed off the Jews even more. So there's just a lot of like, it's a crazy time. It's a hot time. And so when Jesus Christ rides the donkey into Jerusalem, he's basically asking for notice and attention and signing up to be arrested because he's stirring the pot. You know, he knows exactly what he's doing, but I guess I want to set the stage for the stakes. I mean, people kind of think that it's this like really joyous time and everything, and it is, but let's not forget that the reason he's doing it is to draw attention. You know, he knows what's going to happen, and all the Jews and the Romans are watching, and it's Passover. So when you think about those songs in that context, you understand Judas's anxiety much more, especially with the first song that he sings. He's really worried about their lives, and which is completely, valid. But if you look at his perspective, he's looking at it from this like worldly, very non-spiritual perspective. And I think that's where you have the disconnect between him and Jesus Christ throughout the film, is that Christ, even though he has his own anxieties and doesn't know exactly what's going on, Judas just keeps hitting it from, the perspective of the world and the Romans, and basically just really fearful that Christ is putting all their lives in danger. So that's, I think, the crux of their tensions. And I wanted to highlight that as we progress to talk about the different songs and scenes.
Sure. And all this is a very literal exploration of the plot that's played out. It's played off very loosely in the adaptation. So
yeah, and I think that again, for people to understand that this film is about everyone else's perspective except for Christ. I mean, you get his perspective really in one song, which is the Garden of Gethsemane song. But everyone else, has their own perspective. And I think that, again, it's emphasizing even our perspectives on the biblical story. How do we really see Christ, and is it accurate? And are we looking at it from Jesus' perspective, worrying about worldly stuff and, our Roman Empire coming to get us? Or are we looking at it from, a better perspective? So all these things, I think, are working together to really help us question the faith in good ways. So what scene do you want to start with, that being said?
I mean, this is kind of this is a tough one to digest. So I mean, you can take the lead on this.
All right. So one of my favorite scenes is when right after the Hosanna song, and all the disciples and his followers are doing that like crazy, highly energetic dance, and Simon Zelotes has his awesome song and everything like that. And the energy is super high, but it's almost at this crazed level. I mean, these people are like dying in the hot sun, like almost foaming at the mouth with, yeah, it's a really kind of intense scene. But then the energy just drops when you hit Poor Jerusalem song. And Jesus Christ kind of comes in. He's like, no one knows what true power is. Y'all need to calm down. And then he says, neither you or the Romans or even the Pharisees, the scribes, or even Judas, no one knows what true power is because they're all so tied up with this worldly perspective of Christ coming in to be the political hero and not the spiritual hero, which is pretty, that's a thread that runs through the story. But what's really odd about this scene, I want to ask you how you took this line, but in this song, Christ says that to conquer death, you only have to die. So how did you take that? Because it's kind of a weird thing. Because after that, all the disciples look at him and they have this confused look on their face. They're like, what is he talking about? Like, this is not our king. This is not our political savior. So what did you think of that?
Is that biblical even?
It is, yeah. But I want to know kind of just your first...
There's a lot of bravado in that. There's a lot of kind of just encouraging people to be martyrs, I guess, and to jump into the faith, I guess. And not be afraid for your life.
Yeah, I felt that too, but then the way he says it is almost grave as well. It's like he says it, but he sort of knows that no one's going to really understand it. I think it's really interesting how they cut to the different disciples. And even Mary Magdalene, she seems to be like wanting to understand or like almost there with the understanding, but even her, doesn't quite get there. In my opinion, it refers to a couple different sentiments throughout the Bible, but maybe the most succinct one is Romans 8:12, I think. And it says, Paul writes, by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body and you will live. I think, again, going off of what you said, it's sort of about dying to yourself. It's about putting away, I guess, that worldly perspective, again, that seems to plague many characters in the film. And I think that's kind of what Christ is highlighting there, although he does it in a way that can be taken very many different ways, which is important for the audience of the film to figure things out on their own. So
this is a very complicated film.
It is, yeah. And I know I don't want to make this like a Sunday sermon, so sorry, stop me if I'm being too religious, but these...
We're calling this our severely belated Easter special.
Yeah, okay. But, again, I do want to emphasize that the film doesn't really make a case for anything. It just makes a case for everything, and the audience has to decide. So that's, I do want to emphasize that.
It's definitely I wouldn't say almost either the modernist or a postmodernist take on everything. Because obviously, it's like we've talked a few times now, this is people who don't believe trying to figure out how people do believe.
Mm-hmm, that's true. That's a good way to put it.
So people saying these lines, and everyone, and as you're saying with this conversation with Christ saying this line, it reflects not only just the people at the time not understanding it, but people now not understanding
Absolutely.
it, especially all of the actors not understanding it. I mean, just the fact that the musical puts more of attention on almost every single one of the characters except Christ. That's really the whole crux of the structure of the film. It's just what it means to be someone looking up at a transcendent value.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that you said that really well. And you never ever separate the actor from the character. They always are haunted by their modern selves. And again, like the audience always haunts the film because it's for the audience and not to tell a story necessarily, but to live a story. So yeah, you're totally right. The next scene, I think, is the temple scene, and that one's really interesting because you have all of these, you have like guns and prostitutes and everything that could possibly be bad being traded in the temple. And it's interesting because I think when you read the story, you don't necessarily get that perspective. They seem to amp up the sin that's being, I guess, traded and bought in the temple square. So I guess in the Bible, it's more about that they're selling animals and stuff for sacrifice and like trying to make money and that kind of thing.
Profiteering off of sacrifice.
Right. But here, I mean, they're putting in all like the worldly sin you could possibly think about. I mean, military-industrial complex. I mean, just everything. Which is interesting because I actually think that might be more accurate. It's another perspective on, again, what are we doing with our faith, and how does something as innocent and like pure as Christianity fit in with the modern world, or does it? Can it? Yeah, I don't know.
I'm curious if that might be slightly bending the story in a weird direction from I can definitely see someone who'd be much more fundamentalist might have a problem with that, but I think it works within the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. And I suspect that, biblically speaking, the stuff that they did at the temple was probably more along the lines of the things that were portrayed in the movie. Um, Christ, when he comes in and says, my temple is a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of thieves, it's actually a quote from the Old Testament, I think Jeremiah. And in that book, Jeremiah the prophet is actually condemning Israel and the temple square as well for all their sins. So there's kind of this context that the way of life that they're portraying under the Jewish law is like really, really perverse. And so I think that even though the biblical story might not highlight that, that was probably closer to the truth. And again, it's that sense that maybe the historical setting is really not that much different from the modern setting.
Very few things change.
Yeah.
I think we need to pause one more time to go to commercial. We'll be back in a sec. Hello, welcome back to the final segment. We are rapidly running out of battery life, so we got to make this quick.
All right, let's go for it. I have more things to say about Judas and his betrayal and stuff, but it's not as important as talking about the title song, because that really hits home the whole message. And I also want to get to my favorite behind-the-scenes story that Ted Neely and the director will talk about in interviews and stuff like that. And if you haven't looked that stuff up, I highly recommend you do. It's very cool. Okay, so the title song is super interesting because it again highlights Jesus Christ has become this celebrity, and he's definitely not a man anymore. And it's interesting because if you think about Jesus as, divine, you have that transcendent from man to divinity, but then you have a transcendence in this film from man to celebrity. And what's the difference between divinity and celebrity? And I think that's a really interesting question. Do we worship Christ as a celebrity or as a role model for our faith? I think that's a major question. I don't know what you thought about the title song.
That's an interesting concept. I definitely kind of question the rock opera idea, but that definitely plays into why they would do an adaptation like this in the form of a rock opera. It goes back to what I've been saying at verbatim. It's people who are outside of the bubble trying to look in. So people who look at this thing and say externally that this is not how we interact with this, and I don't know if it's necessarily them trying to translate it into a language they understand more specifically, or if it's them specifically saying this is how other people really have a relationship to it.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure either. Or it could just be one of those kind of cold water wake up moments of have you really ever thought about your faith? The whole song, the refrain is what have you really sacrificed, Jesus Christ? Who are you really? Are they who they say you are, and everything? And so those questions again highlight how we look at our faith. Do we know what Christ sacrificed? And I honestly, if you ask Christians today in a church, I'm not sure they'd really be able to explain it. It's kind of a really vague thing. It's powerful and it's the foundation of our faith, but who really can define what that sacrifice meant? It's tough, right? And again, it's interesting because Christ is silent that whole song. You see him and he's in robes, but you don't really know if he's in this space of death or if he's alive or anything. And him being silent is interesting because Judas sort of mocks him throughout the whole song. And he's like, your message has been reached by the whole world. Everyone knows you, despite not coming in a time of mass communication. But again, the message survives even in this time, and it is mass communicated. But the message itself has been completely watered down. And I think that it's turned into this celebrity type thing instead of something that has substance. And so the message reached everyone, but really it didn't reach everyone, if that makes sense.
The modern version of this movie would involve Kevin Sorbo, and it'd be a Pure Flix movie. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, so that being said, if we're an audience that's caught up in the celebrity of it and we don't have any substance for this story, all the questions and the intense tactic to try to get the audience to live the film alongside the actors makes so much more sense, because our job now is to take responsibility for our belief, if we're going to believe this story at all, and to access it through in a personal way, and to get beyond the celebrity and beyond the grandeur and beyond this transcendent non-substance weird thing. and to bring it down into the concrete reality of our own lives. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there, but I do want to talk about this really cool story if we have time, hopefully.
Let's do it quick. Yeah.
Okay, so basically at the end of the movie, you have that like beautiful sunset scene, and you've got the cross and the sun in the back, and it's red, and it's like really dramatic, and the song that plays is John 19:41. Now, if you look up John 19:41, all it says is that Christ was laid to rest in his tomb. Basically, there's no reference to a resurrection. So the soundtrack was always meant to end there, and there was never supposed to be any sort of indication that he was resurrected. Of course, the actor comes out on stage after the fact when they do it on Broadway, and that's a form of resurrection, but it's still outside of the story. So people can kind of think about that, but it's still, they have to choose whether they believe Christ was resurrected or not. However, during the film, when they filmed that scene and they had the field and everything and the sunset, they had their crew, they had the Israeli military basically staking out that field so no one would walk in it and they can get this good shot of the sunset and the cross. So as they were filming it, the director was looking at the film and everything, and he was like, oh my gosh, someone's walking in the scene. There's this like, right underneath the cross, you can see someone walking in the scene. And they're like, well, should we cut it? Like, this is not what we wanted. And he looked closer at it, and it was actually a random shepherd leading like a flock of sheep or goats. And so the director's like, no, if we basically like roped off this whole area and someone still got in and that someone was a shepherd leading a flock of sheep, we're gonna leave it. He's like, that seems to be meant to be. So basically, they accidentally had, and you can see it in the film if you look really closely, underneath the cross towards the end of that scene, a shepherd leading his flock, and that was totally not planned. It was completely serendipitous, and I just think it's interesting because, I don't know, I love coincidences, but in a way, they didn't want to put the resurrection in there, but they kind of did, right? I mean, symbolically with that random person. And it does answer the John 19:41 verse because, they laid him to rest, but then, the shepherd is still walking beneath the cross for those who really want to look and those who really want to follow. So I just thought that was a really interesting coincidence, one of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories, and it kind of just, ties up the whole movie really well.
Well, Orson Welles once said that filmmaking is a series of happy accidents, so it works. That's all the time we have for this episode of the Fox Valley Film Critics. Thank you for coming on. If you want to find past recordings of the show, you can do so at the Groupthink Productions YouTube page. You can follow me on Twitter at AndySocialCritI, that's critic without the C at the end of it, and you can find my written reviews at Legal Insurrection and Weeks Under Grace. I'm Tyler with the Fox Valley Film Critics. Have a wonderful day.